Artists have an important role to play.
It is as central as the air we breathe, as the water we thirst for.
If I want to understand another country, another power, another head of state, I need some background.
I think all our problem, we can fit it with love.
In a conversation about the role of culture and social cohesion, the summit brings a group of Syrian refugees now living in Glasgow, together with human rights advocates and a prominent author. At a moment in human history where no single culture, ideology, theocracy or politics seems to dominate, we should consider how an appreciation of the contributions of many diverse civilizations might help humankind to find common ground. The world is now witnessing an unusual alignment of forces, which has the capacity to disrupt and dislodge some of the most fundamental conceptions of social order. This process is rarely straightforward. As the great German sociologist Ulrich Beck observed, the process of achieving mutual understanding absolutely does not mean uniformity or homogenization. Individuals, groups, communities, political organizations, cultures and civilizations wish to and should remain diverse, perhaps even unique. But to put it metaphorically, the walls between them must be replaced by bridges. And to acknowledge one's multiple identities, to combine forms of life founded on language, skin, color, nationality, or religion, with the awareness that in a radically insecure world, all are equal and everyone is different.
I was born in Strasbourg in France to Turkish parents, and the first house that I was brought into was actually full of immigrants, leftist students, lots of students from the Middle East, and it was a house full of books, gouloirs, smoking cigarettes and talking about revolution. Afterwards, my parents separated and my father stayed in France, and my mother brought me to Turkey because for her, Turkey was motherland. It was where she belonged, whereas for me as a child, it was a completely new country to discover. And in this state, we came to my grandmother's house in Ankara, which was a very conservative, very patriarchal and inward-looking neighborhood. So the second house that I came into was completely different than the first. And from then onwards, I was raised by two women, by my grandmother and by my mother. And these two women were very different from each other. Grandma is more Eastern, if I may put it this way. She was more irrational, more superstitious, a bit more spiritual. And my mother is pretty much the opposite, very westernized, very rational, very modern, urban. And so I grew up observing these two completely opposite female characters, and yet the solidarity and the sisterhood between them, which was very important to me. Afterwards, I spent parts of my childhood in Madrid, in Spain, in Amman, Jordan, a little bit in Germany, Cologne. In my early 20s, I moved to Istanbul on my own because I thought this was a city where I should live and write my stories. But also as a writer, I think from time to time I felt suffocated in Istanbul, mostly because of the lack of freedom of speech. So I moved to Boston, then I moved to Michigan, and I moved to Arizona. And I lived in Arizona for a while, back to Istanbul, and then about 12 years ago I came to London, and the UK became my adopted country. And I feel like a Londoner now, and I feel attached to this country. And the reason I'm sharing all this is because I think it is possible to have multiple belongings, multiple attachments. I care a lot about multiplicity, and I refuse to be narrowed down to a single and singular identity. And if I may add this, throughout my life, I think I felt like wherever I go, it is literature and the art of storytelling that keeps my pieces together. It gave me a sense of continuity and coherence. And I've always connected with life through stories, through the art of storytelling. I was brought up in a matriarchal setting in a very patriarchal society. Turkey is not only patriarchal, but it has become increasingly so over the years. I think it is a very sexist society. I think it's a very homophobic society. And I wish I could have said we have made progress over the years. I'm afraid it's the opposite. In many ways, I think we have been sliding backwards. And I also know that wherever we see a rise in ultranationalism, religious fundamentalism, populist authoritarianism, we will see an increase in sexism, we will see an increase in homophobia, we will see patriarchy being consolidated. These things are not coincidental, they always go hand in hand. And that's why I'm a big believer in sisterhood and women empowering women. I think if we can do that, the impact of that kind of solidarity goes beyond generations. It changes, it changed in my story, not only my mother's life, but also my life and probably my children's as well. So that's why I do believe that we need to see more sisterhood, more solidarity among women. The drive has always been to try to understand who are the people who have been disempowered in a society at a given moment? Who are the people who have been pushed to the margins, the periphery? What are the forgotten stories? So in other words, of course, as a storyteller, I am in love with stories. I chase stories, I love language, I love words. But I equally am interested in silences. So it's not only stories, but silences. When I think about a particular context, I try to understand where are the silences, where are the taboos, what are the subjects that we can't talk about easily. I think a writer's job is not necessarily to try to give the answers. I don't like it actually when writers try to preach or teach something. I don't like that kind of literature. But I think a writer's job is to ask questions, difficult questions about difficult issues, and open up spaces, free spaces where a diversity of opinions can be heard. And then it's always up to the reader to come up with their own answers. But I should create that space. I sincerely believe the novel is one of our last remaining democratic spaces, because in our life, in our lives today, we're constantly being pulled into different tribes, clashing certainties, and only in literature or art, in limited spaces today, we can hear difference of opinions, and that is incredibly important, and we can still put ourselves in the shoes of another person. Literature, for me, from the very beginning, has not been a necessarily autobiographical endeavor. Of course, as writers, when we write, we reflect our own journeys, our own thoughts, our own perceptions, there's no doubt. But writing stories is not necessarily saying, look, this is my story to other people. I am much more interested in not being myself. I'm much more interested in becoming someone else, and then someone else. So that almost transcendental journey. By birth, we're all born into a certain identity, a certain gender, a certain class, a certain nationality, religion, whatever. But when we read a story, at least for a few hours or days, we become someone else. And that experience is incredibly precious. It is an intellectual experience, but it's almost like a spiritual experience. And then suddenly you start seeing things through the eyes of another person.
Mine is a layman's Kaddish, Lord. Modern, universal, ecumenical, and addressed to you, as well as your tormented children. Jews, Christians, Muslims, and all others, believers and non-believers, yearning for peace, freedom, and justice in a genocidal and fratricidal world. My father was born in Poland, and he was one of the youngest survivors of Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek, and other infernos. He came out of the camps at age 16 with a kind of strange sense of optimism. I think for him, that was the ultimate form of survival. Surviving physically was one thing, but he decided that if he walked around depressed and broken, then Hitler had still won. But if he was able to create a new life, to learn to love and live again, to be able to dream, to be able to sing, to recite poetry, then he had really survived. And this is a very important thing, because someone who had lived through so much believed that there is no such thing as hereditary enemies, and that we must talk to one another and exchange with one another and trade with one another, even if ideologically we don't see eye to eye, but that the humanity in it is what's most important. As the last survivors, the last witnesses disappear one by one, as those voices are no longer around, it is up to us, the children of the survivors, and as many of my contemporaries as possible, to take up this message. And the purpose of the Aladdin Project is to fight back against negation, against anti-Semitism, and against all forms of intolerance, with a special focus on the Muslim world. About 10 years ago, when the Iranian regime was really investing a lot of energy and money into denying the Holocaust, a special task force was set up to figure out how to respond to this. Just seems unconscionable that one would deny that the gas chambers existed. It's something I've never understood, but it's also something that we have to reckon with. And they discovered that the Diary of Anne Frank had never been translated properly into Arabic, into Farsi, and into Turkish. And so they decided to translate it. And this led to a series of books, Primo Levi and others, being translated and distributed in those languages throughout the Muslim world. And this has completely changed perception and understanding in a very simple and powerful way. Education and knowledge open the reader's eyes to the world. One can talk about cultural differences even if they have a religious tinge to them in a secular way, because it's part of society, and this is not just about the practice of religion, it is about culture. As a Jew, I feel my Judaism, I would say personally, in a very cultural way more than I do in a religious way. And I think this is true of many people. The other thing that is happening, and it's something we have to not just take into account, but really work with, is the fabric of Europe is changing. There is a substantial part of the population that practices Islam, and that is part of what Europe is and is becoming, and that must continue to be a part of it, and we have to learn to develop this form of social cohesion, but in a way that embraces the differences. And when you see the rise of these rightist parties and of this intolerance and this refusal to accept this change and these evolutions, that is not only disturbing, it is scary and counterproductive. So the big challenge, and this is something Aladdin is working on increasingly, is how to develop this sense of what the French call vivre ensemble, living together in France, throughout Europe. I think we need to be working on it in the United States as well. And it need not have a religious dimension. It's really a cultural dimension. It's about language, it's about literature, it's about culinary traditions, it's about music. So many things that just make all of us richer and more evolved as human beings for being exposed to it. Inherent to the soul and to the creative process of someone who is truly creative and artistic is bound to be influenced by the political climate. Look at how the Renaissance and the Enlightenment opened a new era. These things are very, very tied. And again, look at the creativity that even occurred in the concentration camps. That people were able to write poetry, to write music. I think that is because even in the most hideous of circumstances, or all the more so in the most hideous of circumstances, one needs beauty and creativity. It is necessary. It is a form of nourishment. And in order to maintain their humanity, these prisoners felt that they had to create. These are not happy circumstances, and I don't wish them on anyone. And I wish that all humans and all artists in the world could just create under free and pleasant circumstances. But I don't think the universe is quite there yet.
One of the biggest differences between my current work, working for a peace and reconciliation organization, as opposed to my previous job, which was a more outward face of speaking out against human rights abuses, is that it is more discreet in a way. Even though most people in the UN are obliged to just refrain from speaking out, even when they see pretty awful things, when you have the human rights mandate, as I did, then it's more understood that you can speak out against atrocities and other threats to human rights. When you're working on behind the scenes to promote mediation or peace building at grassroots level, it's certainly something that is less encouraged, because you're going to break the trust that you're trying to build up between warring parties, most of whom, of course, do carry out terrible human rights violations. So if your aim is to get them to talk, first of all, to you and then to the other side, then calling them out for what they're doing is the wrong way to go about it. Essentially, after the Second World War, the powers came together and prepared and largely agreed on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was, and it covered the whole spectrum of rights, because it not only was it looking back at the just finished genocide and massive destruction of war, but it was also looking back slightly further to the Great Depression. So human rights, as they should, were seen as covering economic and social rights, as well as political and civil and cultural. But very soon after that, the world was split, and the communist world put much more focus on social and economic rights, whereas the Western world focused much more on individual and civil and political rights. And there was a dialogue of the deaf in some ways, and not that much progress was made for the next 30 years or so. But by the late 70s, increasingly there was an understanding that one needed to do more. I would say that started unraveling, or at least the progress was halted with the response to the terrible attacks in New York in September 2001. This led a number of governments to decide that fighting terrorism was the only really important thing to be doing, and if human rights of either the people responsible or even just people who got in the way were less important matters to be considered. But things and terrible crimes were committed both by terrorists and by people who said they were fighting a great war against terrorism. Culture has always played a role both in making things better and in making things worse. There's no correlation necessarily between good culture and bad culture. After all, let us face it, the Nazi regime were great admirers of the works of Wagner and of Beethoven and Bach. I mean, they were. I think one would like to think that great music, for example, is a means of softening the soul. But in all too many cases, just last month in July, we had the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre, the worst massacre in Europe since the Second World War. And yet one of the architects of that, Radovan Karadzic, was well known for his love of Mozart. So culture doesn't have to, alas, great culture doesn't have to have a beneficial effect, but it can do. On the other hand, we have seen culture can, and the people and cultural leaders can play a tremendously important role in reducing the social divisiveness and in reducing human rights abuses. To take, for example, in Germany, where I'm now living, we have Daniel Barenboim set up the East-West Divan Orchestra for Israelis and Arab musicians to play together, to get to know one another. That is a vital way of allowing people from different, indeed warring, political and cultural backgrounds to come together. We also saw how Kurt Masur, who was a great conductor in Leipzig at the end of the Cold War, played a vital role when the East German regime was falling in ensuring that the movements that were advancing on various places to try for East Germans to claim their human rights should stay peaceful, and moreover that the falling communist regime should not use brutal force against them. Artists have an important role to play, sometimes perhaps less than they might imagine, but it's still an important role. And particularly those involved in sort of mass culture and with a large audience. But even smaller ones can help create an environment. How they can best work is to at least avoid presenting negative stereotypes. This has been, I think, often the case that culture, whether it's film or books, can either promote unity or it can do the opposite. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel produced before the American Civil War, is regarded as having really woken up people in the northern states of the United States of America to the absolute horrors of slavery. So this work of fiction played a major role in ending one of the great injustices of all time, American slavery. Artists can portray things in a way that can create sympathy for people who are in desperate situations, as Dostoevsky's The House of the Dead, for example, or Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And these have an important impact. So the subject matter of artists and how they portray people, you can either try to flag injustices and shine a spotlight on injustices and to try to promote the rights of victims, or in the case of many other artists, I've recently been reading about Berlin, which is where I live at the moment, how actually artists in the late 19th century really did not grapple with the great social issues of their time to the detriment of, I think, everybody, because it actually helped push Germany into a situation of war with much of the rest of Europe, the First World War I'm talking about. So the role of artists is an important one, and they can either pick up an overtly political, but political from a humane sense, one that actually tries to minimize differences, tries to shine a spotlight on injustice, is one that I think is absolutely vital.
We knew that for the refugees to have produce a compelling performance, it had to be a text that they really identified with, but also for the therapeutic side of it, they were able to share their stories. They could identify with the characters in the play.
We left Syria in 2013 because of the war, and because I couldn't deal with many things around myself in Syria. So there was no choice. So I took my children and went to Jordan. In 2017, luckily, we came to Scotland through UNHCR project for human protection, because we were affected by the war and the condition in Jordan. We came to Scotland, and I found this country, and I still feel it's like I belong to this country and we are really happy here. Finally, for the second time, we can feel safe and welcoming, and we can focus again about normal life, not about difficulties and the suffering that we face in Syria.
Add to my character a lot of things. I have no idea about anything about this world, how to be an actor and how to be a playing. But I didn't imagine in any time I will be an actor in any time. But we have an opportunity to see what we can do. When we start, I take my decision to do something fun. Maybe this is a good opportunity to do something fun for you and for your family. But when we start to do our practice and start to write our rule and our story, I understand what that drama means to produce your story and your suffering from the Trojan platform. This is a great platform to tell Scotland people or Scottish people who we are, at least, and who I am, and what my plan, and why I'm coming here.
The thing that's different about this project is because of the sharing their stories to build the text, they build their own story. So we don't take Euripides as straight. What the directors have always done is they have kept a few of the set pieces, the great soliloquies, the choruses, and then they've ripped the rest of it out and they've allowed the cast to build their own stories into the text of the play.
There's value and things you can do, and you can help others to understand your issue about Syria and about prisoners and about why we are here today, why we want to speak and to make people hear us, and why we need to give voice to my dad or people who are in the prison today, and Syrian lost them. We have no idea what happened with them. I'll never forget the day I left my dad. Everything stopped on the stairs of my home. My dad's face, his eyes, his words. I can't forget what he said and how I felt about him. I didn't want to believe him. The sun was turning red as it set, and it was so cold. I was praying inside my heart. I wanted to hug him, but I couldn't. Why? Because it meant that I wouldn't come back, that he was right, that he knew what the future held for us both. I looked into my dad's eyes. Dad, please, wait for me. I'll come back in a couple of months. Please, believe that. I'll see you one more time. Then he left, just left. Time stopped. Everything was so dark. I couldn't feel anything. I looked at everything around me for the last time.
يلا شو أخذت اليوم مدرسة؟ كنت جالس بالتاكسي ونحن بجانب عائلتي ورا طريقي إلى قطاع دمشق الدولي. كنت حزين جدا وبدأت أشعر بأنني أودع كل شيء حوالي، أودع الحجر، أودع الشجر، أودع الناس، أودع الذاكرة. كان ينتابني حالة شعور بالبكاء، حاولت مقاومة البكاء لم أستطع، والحزن وأنا وغادة دمشق.
لن يفارق حب هذه المدينة وأهلها قلبي أبداً ولا للحظة واحدة، لكن انظروا لها الآن، لقد دمرتها الرماح اليونانية، أضرمت النار فيها، أحرقتها، نهبتها، وانظروا هناك بات الدخان يخنقها الآن.